Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you for that very kind introduction and for the fanfare. That's the first time I've ever experienced a trumpet before a talk, so thank you very much for that. And it's a great opportunity, too, to be invited. Thank you for that because of this interdisciplinary network of the seminar series that is hosted by Torch. So I'm really pleased to be here. Preaching, as defined by 13th century scholastic theologians, was a public event normally held in a church before an audience of men and women. This understanding is based in good part on the theologian Alan of Lille, who described preaching as a manifest and public instruction of morals and faith, serving the formation of humanity, and coming forth from the path of reason and the fount of authorities. Medieval holy women were frequently discouraged to speak in public in any context because dominant theological discourse argued that women were incapable to preach or teach publicly, as they were inferior to men. For example, Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, in the Secunda Secundae, Quaestio 177, Article 2, reasoned that to teach and persuade publicly in church is not the task of subjects, but of prelates. Therefore, public preaching must be done by men because they are superior to women, whereas women are inferior owing to their sex, which is a well-known section of the Summa often quoted on this point. It is no surprise, therefore, that women did not often find themselves in a public pulpit in the Middle Ages. The one exception that immediately comes to mind, of course, is Hildegard of Bingen, who carried out public preaching tours with papal permission in the 12th century. Despite this limiting scope for public teaching, I want to argue that female preaching was more widespread than first assumed. I will argue that preaching came in different forms that often were not scholastic. On this point, my approach differs from Alistair Minnis, who suggests that the scholastic definition of medieval preaching as a public act should be maintained when studying the role of women in pastoral care. If not, scholars run the risk of turning certain speech acts into examples of female preaching, while in fact medieval church authorities would have described these acts as private teaching, but not preaching. Minnis argues that we should instead pay close attention to women deemed to be subversive by medieval authorities, because these examples may get us closer to understanding female engagement in the public sphere. He also argues that by calling a number of speech acts preaching, this mitigates the struggle that some courageous women undertook to enter the public sphere and to fight against, quote, the complex structures of social control and normalization which were then in place, end quote. Now, these are crucial points. The scholastic definition does cover a good deal of what constituted medieval preaching, but it also sets limits on its expansiveness. Medieval preaching was variegated and frequently moved beyond neat classifications. For example, hermits such as John Bono were renowned not so much for what they preached, but for how they lived their lives. Their actions were viewed as sermons rather than any public speech. The transmission of a sermon, therefore, was not necessarily even an oral event. Furthermore, the reception of a sermon could happen in private, without the presence of a preacher, as in the case of late medieval German observant Dominican nuns, who sometimes read vernacular sermon collections. This was a fairly widespread practice in monastic houses, which Michel Zank has notably termed preaching in an armchair. Now, the Latin term sermo also has multifaceted meanings in the Middle Ages. From early in the Christian tradition, particularly with Augustine, sermo had different senses that were interchangeable with the word tractatus, a treatment, homilia, a homily. The word sermo could mean, among other things, discourse, conversation, language, or word, Tractatus could pertain to any learned commentary, whether it was religious or non-religious, oral or written. The term homaleo could mean colloquy, exposition, discourse, and sermon. So there's quite a diverse sense of these meanings. Furthermore, when it comes to gender, the nuances of sermon and preaching are sometimes more generously applied to men than to women. For example, Francis of Assisi, founder of one of the greatest preaching orders in the Middle Ages, is recognized in scholarship as an innovative medieval preacher who used gestures, props, and songs to convey the word of God. Although descriptions of his performative preaching survive, there is little evidence of any written sermons. On the other hand, recent scholarship has argued that to call medieval nuns preachers in their convents is problematic because they gave sermons in private. There, people are adhering to that scholastic terminology again. Therefore, the Vallambrosian nun Humility of Faenza, whose sermons are extant, should be called a teacher rather than a preacher. And that's the argument that is put forward by some scholars. Following this reading, then, or this reasoning, this should lead us to question male preaching. For example, if Bernard of Clairvaux did indeed give his sermons on the Song of Songs originally to his confreres in chapter, should we strictly speaking call him, or any monk preaching in chapter, a teacher instead of a preacher? Should we also dismiss Thomas of Celano's description of Francis of Assisi as a preacher giving a sermon to nuns by circling himself with ashes and pouring the remaining ashes on his head, only to sit in silence and then say a brief prayer before leaving suddenly? Tradition and scholarship would generally answer in the negative. Therefore, when assessing the place of women in preaching history, the same view should be used that is applied to Francis of Assisi and monk preachers. Indeed, it seems appropriate, as a good deal of female preaching was monastic and cloistered. Furthermore, there are examples of women performing the Bible through gestures and words that resonate with what we know of Francis's pastoral approach. To assess the nature of female preaching, I will focus on late medieval Italy. To date, I have worked mainly on Italian sources, but this is just the start of a larger study that will investigate evidence of female preaching in Spain, Germany, France, and England. Today, I will concentrate on 3 women, all associated with the Dominican order: the nun Tommasina Fieschi, there we go, and 2 tertiary Dominicans, Stefana Quinzani and Dominica de Paradiso. We will see that Tommasina and Stefana evoked a sacerdotal stature through their words and mannerisms that relayed a redemptive message worthy to be called preaching. Their words and gestures recall the observations of the 12th century theologian Honorius Augustudensis on the connection between liturgy and theater. As he says, it is known that those who recited tragedies in the theaters represented to the people by their gestures, gestistibus, the actions of conflicting forces. Even so, our tragedian represents to the Christian people and the theater of the church by his gestures the struggle of Christ and impresses upon them the victory of his redemption. I will end with a consideration of Dominica de Paradiso, who provides a compelling example of a woman giving a sermon before men and women. As I hope to show, an investigation into female pastoral activities points to a type of noetic preaching that emphasizes a revelatory and experiential dimension of sermon studies that has been underexplored. I just want to say, too, that about the image here. The image, as you probably see, is not Dominican, it's Franciscan. It's Caterina Vigri, or Catherine of Bologna. She was a preacher in the mid-15th century, left 35 sermons extant, wrote a number of pedagogical works, but her story is for another day. but I couldn't resist the image because of its very great pastoral quality from the late 15th century, striking a rather pastoral pose. So let us turn to Tommasina Fieschi. Tommasina was a well-educated noblewoman from Genoa. By her late 20s, already a widow and mother, she entered the Dominican order in 1477 and followed a life of strict enclosure. She was recognized as an exegete of some renown, producing a commentary on the Apocalypse, which unfortunately has not survived the ravages of time. Her extant letters, sermons, and short treatises reveal her ability as a teacher. They are imbued with biblical and liturgical phrases, images, and themes that require the listener-reader to mull over theological profundities. Tommasina was a sacristan of the Dominican convent of Saints James and Philip in Genoa. She oversaw the sisters' daily life of prayer, maintained the liturgical items used by the priest who tended to the nuns' pastoral care, and was given the responsibility to preach to her sisters. Her 9 extant sermons provide insight into the aspirations of how strictly enclosed nuns attempted to create a life of perfection and contemplation within the walls of their convent. So here's a list of her surviving sermons. Her surviving sermons address dramatical liturgical moments in the Christian calendar. 3 sermons, 2, 5, and 7, are on the Annunciation, 2 on the Nativity, that's 8 and 9, and 4 are dedicated to Maundy Thursday, 1, 3, 4, and 6. The biblical themes of these sermons are presented in Latin, but the sermons are mainly in the vernacular, peppered with biblical quotes and liturgical references in Latin. In most of these sermons, she refers clearly to her audience, the Venerable Mother and beloved sisters of the convent. She also makes it clear that her preaching is an act of obedience. Quote, Venerable Mother and beloved sisters in Christ, to satisfy sufficiently your devotion and to fill my obedience in every way, I consider myself and confess to be naked of virtues. In another sermon for Maundy Thursday, she indicates that she is preaching from election and through the virtue of holy obedience, and thus is obliged to do so. She often refers to her inability to address the stupendous miracles that she is duty-bound to discuss. Now, her sermons demonstrate that Tommasina's preaching was performative. For example, in Sermon 7 on the Annunciation, she involves all her sisters in the meaning of the incarnation narrative. She tells them, quote, Gabriel goes on his way, and in an immense light he enters the room. Both Mary and we are there, end quote. Tommasina develops a dialogue between Gabriel and Christ that explains the incarnation. She takes on the parts of the biblical characters. I think this is here. Quote, Who are you, my Lord? This is Gabriel speaking. Tell me, your servant, and why did you come down, and for whom did you come down? Christ, I am the beginning and the end. That is, I am the creator and redeemer. Why I came down to earth is not to reign, not to judge, not to demand the debt, not to wound or to mortify, but to bring together my little sheep, just as it is said by John in the Gospel, I am the good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. Tommasina's sermons call upon her sisters to become emotionally involved with the life and death of Christ on an interior and exterior level. This type of effective piety became increasingly widespread in the late Middle Ages, as seen in the circulation of the book, The Meditations on the Life of Christ, which was translated into a number of vernaculars. The author of the Meditations asked the reader to enter the emotional world of Jesus, and Tommasina invited her sisters to do the same. She assisted them by assuming at times the persona of Christ in her sermons. For example, in her sermons from Maundy Thursday, she frequently cited John 13, verses 14 to 17, where Jesus washes the feet of his apostles at the Last Supper. In Sermon 3, Thomasina assumes the role of Jesus and says, quote, "I am rising from the table in order to wash your feet, to demonstrate how I have descended from the heavens above," end quote. In her role as Christ, Thomasina explains that she has become enfleshed. "I do this," quote, "so that I may wash your dirt with my own blood," end quote. In Sermon 4, she presents a moving dialogue of Christ talking to his disciples, where she says to her sisters, as if they were the disciples, quote, "Washing you, I cleanse you from sin, and kissing sweetly your feet, I leave you my peace," end quote. Thomasina then changes the mood of the sermon by inviting her sisters to place themselves in the midst of the passion and burial of Christ. But before leading them into this interior imaginative world, she quotes John 14, verse 31, "Rise up, let us go hither." And then she adds, quote, "but not to any exterior entertainment." Now, her allusion to exterior entertainment could be read on several levels. On a literal level, she was urging the nuns to fully embrace cloistered life, as strict enclosure meant the nuns should not and could not leave the monastery. On an allegorical level, Thomasina was encouraging her sisters to shun the exterior in order to build an interior world of religious imagination. For instance, during Easter, there would have been exterior entertainment throughout the streets of many Italian cities in the form of the dramatic Paschal Triduum ceremonies. That is the 3-day period, starting with Maundy Thursday and ending with the evening of Easter Sunday. These were paraliturgical performances in churches and piazzas where the Passion and Deposition would be enacted, sometimes with the use of animated sculptures of Christ. Thomasina tells her sisters not to seek this exterior entertainment, but to create their own ritual and paschal ceremonies in the walls of the convent and travel there with Christ. This is what she says in Sermon 4 for Maundy Thursday. "But weeping and sighing with complete feeling of the heart, let us go with the suffering one to Calvary. And with the Marys, let us embrace the nailed feet. With the beloved Magdalene, let us wonder at the pallid and exhausted face. With John the Evangelist, let us adore the crown of thorns. Let us kiss the wounded side. Let us anoint the wounds of the hands." Thomasina's sermons continually engage the community within the liturgical setting and its revelation of Christian history as lived in her convent. This is movingly portrayed in Sermon 8 on the Nativity of Christ. In this sermon, she alludes repeatedly to the Christ child as this little baby boy, questo piccolino. The emphatic and repeated force of the expression questo piccolino suggests that our preacher was likely referring to a doll of the infant Jesus that she used as a devotional object. Furthermore, Thomasina takes on a Marian persona as she praises the infant Jesus in the overall scheme of Christian history. Quote, "This tiny baby is magnificent. In every loftiness of that magnificence, he has filled my soul so that I no longer know how to hold back my tongue and not to say, Magnificat anima mea, my soul does magnify the Lord." As the sermon progresses, this baby becomes our baby. Thomasina asks her sisters to praise together our tiny baby, nostro piccolino, and wonder with Mary at our little son. At the end of the sermon, there is an indication that she and her sisters may have been standing before an actual nativity scene, because Thomasina tells them that not only in the crib before them, but today, quote, "he was born in the crib of our heart," end quote. Now, these performative aspects that are implied throughout the sermons resonate to some degree with what was happening in male Dominican communities. In 1498, the Dominican friaries that had been under Savonarola's reforming direction in Florence and other areas in Tuscany performed an Epiphany procession of the journey of the Magi and the adoration of the Christ child. It concluded when an infant Christ doll was taken from the Christmas crib and each of the friars kissed its hands, feet, and mouth. Ironically, Savonarola had criticized nuns who used dolls in their worship. He told them, "Nuns, leave off your infant dolls, which are your idols, and come and find me." Nevertheless, the explicit description of the friars' procession, as well as Savonarola's criticism of the bambini used by nuns as objects of worship, fleshes out the implicit references in Tommasina's preaching that called for performative praise within the enclosed walls of Saints James and Philip. Tommasina's nativity sermons established that the Genoese nuns, in keeping with the Florentine friars of San Marco, sometimes used devotional objects to create an interactive form of worship that they could experience both as individuals and in community. Such items permitted these women to have a form of control to express the depth and feeling of their faith by interacting with New Testament narratives. And just here, the material culture of nunneries from the late Middle Ages, from the 15th and 16th centuries, indicate that cradles, miniature cradles like this, and cribs and small dolls of the Christ child were popular, and they were often given to nuns when they took their vows entering into convents. And Caroline Walker-Bynum, of course, has worked on this area. But it seems to resonate in these sermons that Tommasina is preaching as well. We know that Tommasina's performative preaching happened within a rather structured and enclosed context, where she would preach to her sisters on key liturgical events. The case of Stefana Quinzani, a Dominican tertiary from near Brescia, is less straightforward and moves into the realm of performing the Bible in public. Her treatment of the gospel resonates with Francis of Assisi's Christmas sermon in Greccio, where the Poverello preached before a living creche that included an ox and an ass. And this is from the first life of Thomas of Celano's Life of Francis, explaining the scene of the Christmas preaching. Thomas of Celano explains that Francis wanted to retrace Christ's steps and to enact the nativity, which he did with dramatic effect. Quote, "Here is his voice, a powerful voice, a pleasant voice, a clear voice, a musical voice, inviting all to the highest gifts. Then he preaches to the people, standing around him, and pours forth sweet honey about the birth of the poor king and the poor city of Bethlehem. Moreover, burning with excessive love, he often calls Christ the babe from Bethlehem, whenever he means to call him Jesus, saying the word Bethlehem in the manner of a bleating sheep, like Bethlehem, as if the sheep is bleating. He fills his whole mouth with sound, but even more with sweet affection. He seems to lick his lips whenever he uses the expressions Jesus or babe from Bethlehem, tasting the word on his happy palate and savoring the sweetness of the Lord." Stefana performed the Bible like Francis. Orphaned at the age of 15, she worked as a domestic servant. She went on to establish a religious community dedicated to St. Paul and St. Catherine of Siena. Stefana's reputation as a holy woman was based upon her good works and her frequent portrayal of the Passion of Christ, which she often enacted on Fridays in front of numerous audiences, including high-ranking ecclesiastical and political officials. Furthermore, Stefana was recognized schismatic, having a complete identification with Christ by bearing his 5 wounds and crown of thorns. Her performance of the Passion was understood as her acceptance of Christ's Passion, a gift that she received with gratitude during her many performances on Friday. She presented her performative interpretations of the Bible not only before nuns, but as I indicated, publicly in front of priests and lay people. Now, an anonymous eyewitness reported one of Stefana's enactments that occurred on Friday, the 17th of February, 1497. It lasted for 4 hours. Don't worry, this will not last for 4 hours. So, and took place in Crema at her patron's house, Gian Francesco Verdello. 21 eyewitnesses signed a testimony to indicate that they were in attendance. All the signed witnesses were men with professions, including clerics, medical doctors, civil and canon lawyers, as well as a public notary. I should also add, she once did the same performance in Mantua in the year 1500 before the members of the Gonzaga court, and including Isabella d'Este. So, of course, she performed in front of women as well. But the signing by the witnesses were just by the men. Now, the anonymous observer of the 1497 event clarified that Stefana enacted the drama through distinct gestures, but no actual devotional items were employed. So it was kind of mime. She spoke all the parts, well, I guess not so much mime, but she spoke all the parts, but her acting of the gestures were. When she started, the first person to speak was the devil, who said, quote, "Many people want to see you. You want them to call you a saint," end quote. She denied these allegations of pride, and then her enactment began. The eyewitness explained, "Her hands are tied above her head with insoluble but invisible straps, and her feet are tied as well. She is like Christ when he was tied to the pillar. Her visible bodily movements make it clear that she is being invisibly flagellated. Her whole body moves for half an hour, but her hands and feet are immobile, just as if they were tied with real cord on the pillar." Now, I think Stefana's pose resonates or may have looked something like this. It looks extremely performative, the pose, the way the feet are placed with the hands above the head as well. Normally, the flagellation of Christ, the hands are placed in front, but this is above, and I think it's a rare example of perhaps where we can gain a bit of insight to the way Stefana may have been moving as she presented the Passion story. The eyewitness observed that Christ wanted Stefana to accept his passion, to what she replied, "Lord, I am not worthy of suffering this holy passion, but Lord, may your sacred will always be done." Her hands are then tied in front of her with the same invisible ties. Just when Pilate examined Jesus Christ, Jesus' hands were tied in this way. Again, I think this image of this image of the Passion narrative does capture the types of poses that Stefana would have been making and her audience would have well recognized. Now, at the end of the Passion play, when she came down from the invisible cross upon which she had remained for an hour, she made gestures and words that indicated Jesus was before her, and she thanked him for the passion that he gave her and prayed for the souls of the people. And interestingly, she prayed especially for preachers so that their preaching would be fruitful. Now, perhaps her explicit reference to preachers implied Stefana's identification with them. In any case, mendicant preachers in the late Middle Ages were not shy to evoke deep emotion through high drama when preaching on Good Friday. The observant Franciscan Ladislaus of Genilov, a Polish preacher who was the guardian of the Warsaw Friary, gave an impassioned sermon on Good Friday in 1505, which was recorded in his Vita. He began his sermon rising up from a chair with such a deep sigh that anguish appeared to coil up like a snake in his heart. Ladislaus' voice was powerful but sad, and he was more like an angel on the stage rather than a man. He portrayed the unfortunate events of the Passion with grief-stricken gestures. When Ladislaus recounted the flagellation of Jesus, his performance intensified with the help of graphic props. Quote, "Now was set up a column in an appropriate spot with switches, prickly whips, and chains, imagining the column to represent the atrocities of the flagellation with a nude icon of Christ affixed to it for cruel whipping, he took up the instruments of brutality in his own hands and turned his eyes to the icon of the nude Christ tied to the column with its sorrowful head bowing down. Ladislav began to scream in a voice at once wretched, furious, and fierce. O Jesus, my love. Suddenly his whole body trembled. His tongue stuck in his throat, his heart numb, overcome with the vehement affection of compassionate sorrow. He wanted to talk more, but overcome with the sorrow, he was no longer able, full of grief and sapped of strength. Just an example of the type of life-size icon that could be strapped to this column is this 15th century example of a movable statue with the arms, as you can see, the joints can move, the head tilts, the body can be used as a giant doll in these very dramatic occasions for the Good Friday preaching. A number of these life-size dolls still survive, and if you are interested in them, Camille Capania has done an excellent study of them in his book Animated Sculptures of the Crucified Christ in the Religious Culture of the Late Middle Ages, which I recommend very highly. It's an astounding study. Now, closer to home, Florentine Good Friday preaching was known to include the appearance of a naked man portraying a stumbling Christ. Within this context, Stefana's gestures and words complement part of a larger tradition of dramatic Good Friday preaching, in which high liturgical moments on the calendar were enhanced by enactments that at once created and evoked shared memories based on the New Testament. What's interesting, too, is that Stefana not only is recounting the words of the Bible in the New Testament story, but she also embodies the characters as she recounts them. That Stefana may have perceived herself as preaching is not out of the realm of possibility, nor is it anachronistic. On the 4th of July, 1507, in Florence, her contemporary, the Dominican tertiary Dominica de Paradiso, gave a sermon to her spiritual daughters and to 3 of her spiritual fathers on the meaning of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 14:34. Let women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak, but to be subject, as also the law says. Now, although about 20 of Domenica's sermons have come down to us, this particular sermon has not. But an account of it by one of her spiritual directors, Francesco da Castiglione, has. Francesco reported that on the 5th of July, the night after her sermon on the theme of 1 Corinthians 14:34, Dominica was doubtful about what she had preached. However, Paul appeared to her and reassured her that all she said was inspired by Christ and therefore was true. Domenica's dialogue with Paul reveals the content of her sermon. Her preaching is clarified and validated through the visions in which Paul gives a direct report of what his verses actually mean or meant. This perhaps was a less subversive way to preserve the sermon, that is, as a vision taken down by a confessor where all the provocative interpretations are said in Paul's voice and not Domenica's. It is worth noting that Dominica did not tone down her preaching as the years went on. In 1519, Francesco again defended her against accusations of inaccurate biblical interpretations alleged by disgruntled Dominicans who carried the torch for Savonarolan reforms. Now, getting back to her sermon on 1 Corinthians 14:34, Dominica explains that the verse, "Let women keep silent in the churches," was meant for the Corinthian women alone because they were making a racket while Paul was trying to preach. So he admonished them to be quiet. The only people who should be prohibited from preaching are those who have no respect for God. paraphrasing 1 Corinthians 1, verses 27-29, Dominica said that God had not chosen knowledge or riches, but kindness and simplicity to confound the proud. Many women have been filled of the Holy Spirit and have preached about the Christian life and doctrine. These women are celebrated in Holy Church, and their souls are in heaven because they preached no error, but did the will of their spouse, and thus by doing so they did not contradict Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 14:34. Dominica's defense of a woman's right to preach publicly is notable for many reasons. It challenged the widespread and dominant arguments against female public teaching, including the 12th century assertion in Gratian's Decretum that women, no matter how holy or saintly, should not presume to teach men. Within its specific historical context, her defense is especially remarkable when we consider that it was made in the hostile aftermath of Savonarola's downfall and death. The Dominican reformer Savonarola had a conflicted relationship with women and their saintly potential. He once preached in 1496 that, quote, God gives prophecy to whomever he wants, to men and women, and to highborn and lowborn, end quote. A year later, however, when a prophetess and nun called Maddalena began publicly denouncing Savonarola throughout Florence and predicted his imminent demise, he preached another sermon. Paul says, mulieres in ecclesiae tecient, it is good for women to stay silent and not to chatter all the time. You women cannot distinguish because you have never learned, whether your visions derive from a natural light and are therefore good or whether they are opposite. And note that one can be a prophet and go to the house of the devil. Dominica herself was a devotee of the martyred Savonarola. However, she was unwilling to go along with his followers, who wanted her to desist from expressing any reforms that diverged from Savonarola's vision of a renewed church, which included strict enclosure for religious women. They were particularly unhappy that she aspired to the active female apostolate as lived by Catherine of Siena. They could not bring Dominica to heel. Her sermon on 1 Corinthians 14:34 was delivered 2 years before she completely broke from the reforming Florentine Dominicans in 1509. Her frustration with preachers who thought they lived a good life and were authorities of the Bible is apparent in her Pauline sermon. Quote, woe therefore to those, that is preachers, who on the day of judgment will be disgraced by their evil workings in comparison to little old ladies who barely knew the Hail Mary. Then it will be shown to them that they knew nothing at all, and that in these little old ladies who did not seek the world's honor but God's love, there is true knowledge and true wisdom. These women are those whom the Lord causes to speak, to preach, and to prophesy, because in him there is the will and the power. Ipse dicit e facta sunt. He speaks and they did. So, in conclusion, Thomasina's sermons indicate that she took on the personas of Christ, Mary, and Gabriel, and that she used gestures to accompany her preaching. The movements and words of Stefana, although not explicitly called sermons, had a pastoral element to them that resonated with the preaching style of Francis and the drama of Good Friday preaching more generally. These women wanted to convince and inspire their audience using appropriate words and gestures as a mode of persuasion based on biblical narratives. By so doing, like Honorius's priest in the theater of the church, these women wished to impress upon their audiences the struggle of Christ and the victory of his redemption. Dominica challenged the very foundations of scholastic restrictions on female preaching by reinterpreting long-held exegetical treatments of Pauline injunctions against a woman's right to preach or to speak in public. Her bold reconstruction of Paul into an advocate of public female teachers is a notable development in the history of sermon studies. All three women elucidate the significant role women played in the history of education and preaching, shattering the glass pulpit of female silence. you.